Space has rules, laws of physics that bind us, give us structure. But every now and then, those rules break, or maybe they bend so far that they let something or someone slip through. That's what happened to Vega. One moment. She was standing right there on the nebula's Grace 2, her voice echoing in the comms as we plotted our next mission. The next, she was gone. No explosion, no sound, just a flash of light and a tear in the air that swallowed her whole. For weeks, we combed the ship, checked every system, ran every simulation, but nothing made sense. Nothing except the impossible. She wasn't lost in space. She was lost somewhere else. The trail led us to Krylo 7, a barren world on the edge of the known galaxy. The locals whispered of a rift, an anomaly that opened to other places, other dimensions. Most called it a curse. A few called it a gateway. I didn't care what it was called. I only cared that it might lead me to Vega. Every mission comes with risks, but Vega wasn't just another crew member. She was family. She'd saved my life more times than I could count, both on and off the battlefield. That's why losing her felt like losing a piece of myself. For weeks after the event, the ship felt quieter. Darnell didn't laugh as much. Jenkins worked in silence, his usual sarcasm absent. Even the hum of the engine seemed subdued, as if the nebula's Grace to itself mourned her absence. She's not gone, I told myself every night, staring at the faint shimmer in the air where the rift had first appeared. Not yet. The rift had closed as suddenly as it had opened, leaving nothing behind but questions. We scanned for hours, searching for radiation spikes, gravitational anomalies, anything that could explain what had happened. But there was nothing, until now 0.3 months after Vega disappeared. The faintest trace of her comm signal appeared on our long-range scanners. "It's weak," Darnell said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "But it's definitely her." I stood frozen, my mind racing. "Can you triangulate it?" I asked. "It's not that simple," he replied, frowning at the console. "The signal's fragmented. It's bouncing through subspace, like it's coming from multiple places at once." "Then find one," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. Darnell didn't argue. He worked in silence, his fingers flying over the controls. "It's coming from Krylo 7, he said finally, his expression grim. Jenkins whistled low. "Of course it is. Because why wouldn't it be the most cursed planet in the sector? Krylo 7 wasn't just any barren rock. It was a place of legends, none of them good. Explorers spoke in hushed tones about the rift that lay hidden within its jagged canyons, a tear in reality that defied explanation. "Captain, I'm not saying I believe the stories," Jenkins said as we prepared for the descent. "But if even half of what people say about this place is true, we're walking into a nightmare." "Nightmares don't scare me," I replied, strapping into my seat. "Maybe they should," he muttered. The nebula's Grace 2 broke through Krylo's Vi's atmosphere, its shields flaring against the planet's turbulent winds. The ground below was a lifeless expanse of cracked earth and jagged rock, bathed in the eerie glow of the planet's blood-red sky. "Landing coordinates locked," Darnell said. "Bringing her down." The ship touched down near the edge of a massive canyon, its walls lined with strange, angular formations that seemed almost deliberate. "This place gives me the creeps," Vega, the medic, said, stepping off the ramp. "You're not alone," Jenkins replied, scanning the horizon. "This whole planet feels wrong." The air on Krylo 7 was thin and bitterly cold, carrying with it a faint metallic taste that clung to the back of my throat. "Radiation levels are low," Darnell reported, "but there's a lot of electromagnetic interference. Enough to mess with our equipment if we're not careful." "Captain," Vega called out, pointing toward the canyon. "You're going to want to see this." I followed her gaze to a series of symbols carved into the canyon walls, their shapes sharp and angular, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. "They match the energy signature of the rift," she said, her voice hushed. "What do they mean?" I asked. "Your guess is as good as mine," she replied. but they're definitely not natural. As we moved deeper into the canyon, the symbols became more frequent, their glow intensifying. "Captain," Jenkins said, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "You sure we're alone out here?" "Why?" I asked, scanning the jagged rocks. "Because it feels like we're being watched," he replied. The canyon opened into a massive valley, its center dominated by the rift, a shimmering tear in reality that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, its edges warping the air around it like heat waves. "Scanners are going wild," Darnell said, his voice tight. "This thing's putting out more energy than anything I've ever seen. Is it stable?" I asked. "Barely," he replied. "If we're going through, we'll need to anchor it with the generator." I nodded, my eyes fixed on the rift. "Then let's get to work." As we set up the portable generator, shadows began to flicker within the rift. At first, they were faint and indistinct, like reflections on water, but as the generator powered up, they became clearer. Humanoid figures moving with a strange, fluid grace. "Are those people?" Vega whispered. "Not people," Jenkins said, his voice trembling. "Not anymore." The figures turned toward us, their glowing eyes locking onto ours. "Captain," Darnell said, his voice shaking. "We've got movement." The shadows began to emerge from the rift, their forms twisting and shifting as they stepped into our reality. "Everyone, back to the ship," I shouted, raising my rifle. The creatures didn't charge. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if testing us. Their forms shimmered, constantly changing, as if they couldn't fully exist in our world. "Captain, we need to shut the rift down," Darnell yelled. "No," I said, my eyes fixed on the creatures. "Not until we find her." As the shadows surrounded us, the rift pulsed violently, and a voice echoed through the air. "Rogers." It was faint and distorted, but unmistakable. "It's her," I said, my heart racing. "Captain, this is insane." Jenkins shouted. "We need to leave." "I'm not leaving her," I said, stepping closer to the rift. The shadows stopped suddenly, their heads tilting as if they were listening. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they retreated back into the rift. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me. Get the stabilizers ready," I said. "We're going in." The moment we stepped through the rift, reality itself seemed to rebel against us. My body felt stretched and compressed all at once, as if I was being torn apart and put back together in the same instant. Colors I couldn't name flashed before my eyes, and sounds that didn't belong to any earthly spectrum roared in my ears. Then, just as suddenly, it was over. I stumbled forward, gasping for air, my boots hitting solid ground that wasn't quite ground. It was soft, like the surface of a sponge, and pulsed faintly underfoot. The sky above us was fractured, its pieces swirling and shifting like the fragments of a shattered mirror. "We're somewhere," Jenkins muttered, clutching his helmet as if to steady himself. "This is insane," Vega said, her voice trembling. "I've seen anomalies before, but this isn't natural." "It's not supposed to be," I replied, scanning the horizon. The world around us was a patchwork of alien landscapes, as if pieces of 1,000 different dimensions had been stitched together. Forests of glowing trees stretched into the distance, their leaves shimmering like liquid light. Jagged mountains loomed on the horizon, their peaks glowing faintly with an ominous green hue. And then there was the air, thick and heavy, filled with a strange hum that vibrated through my bones. "Captain," Darnell called out, his voice shaking. "I've got her signal. It's stronger now, but it's moving." We followed the signal through the shifting terrain, every step a battle against the strange, living ground beneath us. It wasn't just the terrain that shifted. The entire landscape seemed to move, rearranging itself as we walked. "Captain, this place isn't stable," Vega said, her voice tight. "The terrain is changing faster than I can map it." "Keep moving," I said, gripping my rifle tightly. The signal led us toward a forest of crystalline structures that jutted out of the ground like massive shards of glass. They hummed faintly, their surfaces refracting the broken sky into a kaleidoscope of shifting colors. "This place feels alive," Jenkins muttered, glancing around nervously. "It probably is," Vega replied, her tone grim. "The energy readings here are off the charts. Whatever this dimension is, it's not just a location, it's a system, and we're inside it." As we entered the crystalline forest, the hum grew louder, reverberating through the air like a low, constant chant. "Captain, I don't like this," Darnell said, his eyes darting around. "Stay focused," I replied, scanning the area. The first attack came without warning. A shadow detached itself from one of the crystals, its form shifting and flickering like a broken hologram. It moved toward us with an unnatural speed, its limbs elongating as it lunged. "Contact!" I shouted, raising my rifle. The plasma bolt hit the creature square in the chest, but it didn't stop. It reformed almost instantly, its body rippling like liquid. "Fall back!" Vega yelled, firing her own weapon. More shadows emerged from the crystals, their forms twisting and multiplying. They moved like predators, surrounding us in an ever-tightening circle. "They're not physical," Jenkins shouted, his voice trembling. "We can't kill them." "Then we slow them down," I said, firing at the base of one of the crystals. The explosion sent shards flying, and the shadows recoiled, their forms flickering erratically. "They're linked to the crystals," Vega said, realization dawning on her face. "The structures are stabilizing them. If we destroy the crystals, then we destroy them," I finished. "Darnell, set charges on the largest ones," I ordered. "On it," he replied, moving quickly as the rest of us provided cover. The charges detonated in a brilliant burst of light, shattering the largest crystals. The shadows let out an unearthly wail before dissolving into wisps of smoke. "Let's move," I said. My voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. The signal grew stronger as we left the forest behind, but so did the sense of unease. The air felt heavier, the hum louder, as if the dimension itself was reacting to our presence. "Captain," Vega said, her voice low, "we're not alone." I followed her gaze to the horizon, where massive, humanoid figures stood like statues. Their forms were composed of the same crystalline material we just destroyed, their eyes glowing faintly with a cold, blue light. "They're not moving," Jenkins whispered. "Yet," I said. As we approached, the figures turned their heads in unison, their glowing eyes locking onto us. "Okay, now they're moving," Darnell said, his voice tight with panic. The Guardians moved slowly at first, their footsteps shaking the ground beneath us. But as we drew closer to their domain, a massive, glowing chasm that pulsed with the same energy as the rift, they began to pick up speed. "Open fire!" I shouted. Plasma bolts ricocheted off their crystalline bodies, the impacts creating spiderweb cracks that quickly healed. "It's not working," Vega yelled. "Darnell, can you disrupt their energy source?" I asked, pointing at the glowing chasm. He nodded, already working on his portable disruptor. "Cover me!" The Guardians closed in, their massive arms swinging with deadly force. One of them smashed into the ground near Jenkins, sending him sprawling. "Get up!" I shouted, pulling him to his feet. Darnell activated the disruptor, sending a pulse of energy toward the chasm. The Guardians froze, their forms flickering as the pulse destabilized the energy field. "Let's go!" I shouted, leading the way toward the chasm. The chasm wasn't just a fissure in the ground. It was the source of the dimension's instability. The air here was almost liquid, every breath a struggle. At the center of the chasm stood another figure, smaller but more human-like. Its form flickered like Vega's had in the hologram, its face shrouded in light. "Captain," Vega whispered, her voice trembling. "It's her." "Vega," I called out, stepping closer. The figure turned toward me, its face resolving into something almost recognizable. It was Vega, but she wasn't alone. Shadows clung to her form, their tendrils twisting and writhing as if trying to pull her back. "Help me," she said, her voice breaking. The Guardians roared behind us, their forms stabilizing as the disruptor's pulse faded. "We're out of time," Jenkins said. "Not yet," I replied, stepping into the chasm. The moment I stepped into the chasm, the world around me dissolved into chaos. Colors bled together like spilled paint, and the air felt heavy, suffocating. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if I were walking through layers of overlapping realities. "Captain," Vega's voice called out faintly, but it wasn't coming from the comms. It was coming from everywhere. I turned, trying to pinpoint her location, but the shadows warped around me. The terrain shifted, pulling me deeper into the chasm, while the rest of the crew struggled to follow. "Stay together," I shouted, but my voice felt muffled, swallowed by the oppressive hum of the dimension. Ahead of me, the figure of Vega flickered like a mirage, her body wrapped in the twisting tendrils of shadow. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Rogers," she said, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't have come." "I'm not leaving without you," I said, stepping closer. But the shadows tightened their grip on her, pulling her back toward a glowing nexus at the center of the chasm. "Captain," Jenkins shouted from behind me, "the Guardians are coming." The massive crystalline figures loomed above us, their glowing eyes burning like cold stars. They moved with purpose now, their footsteps shaking the ground as they closed in. "Darnell, give me some breathing room," I barked. He nodded, deploying the disruptor again. The pulse sent a wave of distortion through the air, causing the Guardians to falter for a moment. "It's not going to hold them for long," Darnell warned. "Vega, Jenkins, hold the line," I said. "I'll get her out." "Captain, you can't do this alone," Vega shouted, but I was already moving toward the Nexus. The shadows hissed as I approached, their forms coiling protectively around Vega. The Nexus pulsed with a sickly green light, its energy warping the space around it. The shadows seemed to flow from it like a living river, their forms twisting and stretching toward the sky. "Let her go," I shouted, raising my rifle. The shadows responded with a deafening roar, their tendrils lashing out. I fired, but the plasma bolts dissipated uselessly against the Nexus's energy field. "Captain, the Nexus is feeding off her," Vega, the medic, yelled from behind me. "If you don't sever the connection, it'll consume her completely." "How?" I asked, dodging another tendril. She hesitated. "You'll need to overload it, but you'll have to be close." "Too close?" I gritted my teeth, my gaze fixed on Vega. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "I'm not letting you go," I said. Stepping closer to the Nexus reacted violently as I approached, its energy flaring in pulses that sent shockwaves rippling through the ground. The shadows lashed out, their tendrils slicing through the air like whips. "Captain, get back!" Jenkins shouted. "No!" I shouted back. "I'm ending this." I pulled the portable generator from my pack, setting it to overload. The device began to hum, its lights flashing red as it built up energy. "You don't have to do this," Vega said, her voice breaking. "I'm already gone." "No, you're not," I said, my voice firm. "You're coming home." I activated the generator and threw it into the Nexus. The explosion was instantaneous. The Nexus flared with a blinding light, and the shadows let out an ear-piercing scream as they began to disintegrate. The tendrils around Vega unraveled, and she fell forward into my arms. "Got you," I said. Pulling her close, the dimension around us began to collapse, the fractured skies splintering further as the ground beneath us crumbled. "Captain, we need to go," Vega, the medic, shouted. I lifted Vega, the lost one, to her feet, supporting her weight as we stumbled back toward the crew. The Guardians, now unstable without the Nexus's energy, shattered into pieces, their forms collapsing into the ground like glass. The rift appeared ahead of us, its edges flickering violently as the dimension continued to fall apart. "Move, move," I shouted, pushing the crew forward. One by one, we jumped through the rift, the sensation of tearing through reality hitting me like a punch to the gut. We stumbled back onto Krylos 7, the harsh wind and red skies a welcome sight after the chaos of the other dimension. The rift behind us flickered one last time before collapsing in on itself, leaving nothing but a faint shimmer in the air. "Status report," I said, my voice hoarse. "Everyone's accounted for," Darnell replied, though he looked as shaken as I felt. I turned to Vega, the one we brought back. She was pale, her body trembling but alive. "You found me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Always," I replied, squeezing her hand. The air on Krylos 7 was cold and sharp, biting at my lungs as we regrouped near the nebula's Grace 2. The rift was gone now, its faint shimmer replaced by the endless expanse of barren wasteland. But its impact lingered, not just in the scars it left on this world, but in the fractures it had created within us. Vega, the real Vega, the one we'd risked everything to save, leaned against me, her legs still unsteady from whatever torment the dimension had put her through. Her face was pale, her eyes distant, as though she wasn't fully back in our world yet. "We've got you," I said softly, guiding her up the ship's ramp. "Did you?" She hesitated, her voice trembling. "Did you see them?" I stopped, turning to look at her. "See who?" "The others," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "They were trapped there, just like me. I could hear them, feel them. They wanted me to stay." My stomach tightened. I didn't ask for details. Not yet. She needed time, and so did I. The mood aboard the ship was somber. Darnell worked in silence at his station, rerouting power to systems that had strained under the dimensional interference. Jenkins sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at a datapad, his usual banter absent. Even Vega, our medic, had retreated to her quarters, the weight of what we'd faced pressing down on all of us. I stood on the bridge, staring out at the blood-red sky of Krylos 7. We'd won, if you could call it that. Vega was back, and the rift was gone. But the cost of that victory hung heavy in the air, an unspoken question that none of us wanted to answer. Was it worth it? "Captain," Darnell said, breaking the silence, "we've stabilized the engines. We're ready to leave orbit." "Good," I replied, though my voice lacked its usual conviction. "Set a course for neutral space. We need to regroup and figure out what comes next." It was hours before Vega emerged from the medical bay, her steps hesitant but determined. Her pale face had regained some of its color, though the haunted look in her eyes hadn't faded. "Captain," she said softly, standing in the doorway of the bridge. I turned, giving her a small nod. "Vega, you should be resting." "I've rested enough," she replied, her voice firmer now. "We need to talk." I gestured for her to sit, and she sank into the chair across from me, her hands clasped tightly together. "They weren't just shadows," she said, her words spilling out in a rush. "The things in that dimension, they were alive. They weren't like us, but they were alive, and they're still there." I leaned forward, my brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. "It wasn't just a place. That dimension, it's a prison, a trap, and whatever's in there, it doesn't want to stay trapped." Her words sent a chill down my spine. The thought of something greater, something incomprehensible waiting on the other side of that rift. It wasn't something I wanted to think about, but I couldn't ignore it either. "Did they tell you this?" I asked carefully. "Not in words," she said. "It was more like impressions, feelings. They showed me things, visions of other worlds, other dimensions, places where they'd escaped before. And every time, they left destruction in their wake. And the rift here, it wasn't natural," she replied, her gaze locking with mine. They opened it. They were trying to spread. Then we stopped them, I said, though my words felt hollow. For now, she said that night, the crew gathered in the mess hall, a rare occurrence given the tension that usually followed missions like this. Jenkins poured himself a glass of something strong, his hands trembling slightly as he took a sip. I'm not gonna lie, he said, breaking the silence. That was the worst thing I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot. Worse than Zeta 9? Darnell asked, his tone light, but his expression serious. Zeta 9 was a walk in the park compared to this, Jenkins replied. At least on Zeta 9, the things trying to kill us made sense. We survived, Vega the medic said, her voice steady. And we brought her back. That's what matters. But at what cost? Jenkins muttered. The cost we're always willing to pay, I said, stepping into the room. For each other. Later, in the quiet of my quarters, I recorded my log. It was a ritual I'd maintained through every mission, a way to make sense of the chaos. This is Captain John Rogers of the Nebula's Grace 2. Mission to Krylos 7. Completed. The rift is closed and Vega is back. But the cost of our success lingers, like a shadow over the crew. What we faced on the other side of that rift defies explanation. The things we saw, the things we fought, they weren't just enemies. They were warnings, signs of something far greater than ourselves, something waiting in the dark corners of the universe. Vega says the dimension was a prison. If that's true, then we've only scratched the surface of a much larger threat. I don't know what comes next, but I do know this. We'll face it together, as we always have. Until next time, stay curious, and keep looking up. As the Nebula's Grace 2 left Krylos 7 behind, I stood on the bridge, staring out at the endless void. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a beginning. Where to, Captain? Darnell asked. I hesitated, the weight of our journey pressing down on me. Anywhere but here, I said finally. The ship's engines roared to life, and we disappeared into the stars.